Naval Air Station Fort Lauderdale sat on flat coastal land in Broward County, Florida, and on the afternoon of December 5, 1945, it sounded the way it always sounded. Radial engines turning over on the apron, the smell of aviation fuel drifting across the tarmac in the warm salt air, the Atlantic close enough that its particular quality of light lay across everything, low and bright and indifferent to the particular business of any given afternoon. The base had been operational since 1942. It had processed hundreds of student aviators through its standard overwater navigation exercises in the years since, and the mission being assembled on this particular December afternoon was, by every administrative measure, a routine one. Navigation problem number 1. A triangular course drawn in pencil over a chart of the Bahamas. Nothing about the day, looked at from the tarmac or the briefing room or the operations log, indicated it was different from any other. The 5 aircraft assigned to the mission were TBM Avengers, torpedo bombers that had served throughout the Pacific Campaign and had by December 1945 become the standard instrument of overwater navigation training at stations along the Atlantic coast. Each aircraft was approximately 40 feet long with a wingspan of 54 feet. Each was powered by a single Wright R2600 radial engine, a 14-cylinder air-cooled unit that produced approximately 1,900 horsepower at takeoff and made, when it turned over on startup, the deep percussive rumble that had become as ordinary a sound at NAS Fort Lauderdale as the wind off the ocean. These 5 aircraft carried tail designations that placed them in the institutional record precisely: FT-28, FT-36, FT-3, FT-117, and FT-81. The designations were painted on their fuselages in the plain stenciled lettering of Navy practice aircraft, and in the flat afternoon light, they would have read clearly across the tarmac apron: 5 aircraft lined in sequence, their 54-foot wingspans casting long shadows westward across the concrete. The mission they were assigned to fly was standard in every procedural respect. Navigation problem: no. One was designed to take the formation east from Fort Lauderdale over open water to a practice bombing area at Hen and Chicken Shoals, approximately 160 miles northeast of the base. From there, the course would carry the aircraft north for 40 miles, before turning westward on a long arc that would bring the formation back over the Florida coast and down to the base from the north. The whole triangular route intended to give student aviators experience navigating over featureless open water without visible landmarks. The route was familiar to the instructors who flew it regularly. The chart was a standard aeronautical map of the Bahamas region. The pencil line marking the triangular course lay flat across it on the briefing table, with the ordinariness of a thing done many times before. Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor was 28 years old. He held approximately 2,500 logged flying hours, a substantial total for a man his age. Assembled through training, assignment, and Pacific combat experience that had taken him through the late years of the war, in the kind of sustained operational flying that builds a particular quality of confidence in the air. The kind that comes not from classroom study, but from a long accumulation of hours in which the instruments and the aircraft and the body's own sense of position in space have had time to become familiar to one another. He was, by the records kept of such things, an experienced aviator. The Navy's training apparatus at Fort Lauderdale had accepted him as qualified to lead student navigation flights over open water, and by the formal measure of hours logged and experience recorded, that acceptance was well founded. Taylor had only recently transferred to NAS Fort Lauderdale. This detail appears in the subsequent investigation documents without elaboration. As a plain fact, he had been at the station for a limited time and had flown the specific overwater navigation routes out of Fort Lauderdale less often than instructors who had been posted there longer. The Bahamas routes, the particular pattern of islands and shoals and open water that made up the navigational landscape east of Florida, were not as thoroughly known to him as they would have been to an instructor who had flown them dozens of times across many months. This is recorded as a circumstantial detail. The investigation noted it. It did not at the time of departure constitute any formal cause for concern. On the morning of December 5th, Taylor reportedly attempted to have another officer take over as flight leader. The account of this is preserved in the naval investigation documents, recorded there without formal explanation, because no formal reason was noted at the time. What the documents state is that Taylor expressed a preference not to fly that day, and that he made this preference known to the degree of requesting that someone else lead the mission. The request was not granted. No record survives of the reason Taylor gave for the preference, or whether he gave a reason at all. The documents preserve the fact of the request and record that it was denied, and then the record moves forward without dwelling on it, the way operational logs move forward, recording what happened, noting the exception, and continuing. The other 13 men assigned to the flight are named in the Navy records with the same plain institutional attention. Captains Edward Powers and Joseph Gerber were among the more experienced aviators aboard, their names preserved alongside those of student naval aviators, whose records at the time of their assignment reflected the particular in-progress quality of men still being trained. Corporals George Paonessa and Herman Thalander appear in the records among the student aviators, their names set in the same columns and in the same type as every other man aboard. 14 men in total, 5 aircraft. Navigation problem number 1. The afternoon of December 5th, 1945, at a naval air station on the flat coastal land of Broward County, Florida, where the air smelled of salt and the radial engines on the apron made their deep, ordinary sound. The briefing for the mission would have taken place in one of the station's standard instruction rooms, a room with charts on the walls and a table flat enough to lay a Bahamas navigation chart across without it curling. The course for navigation problem number 1 was a triangle, and a triangle is among the simpler shapes a pencil can draw on a chart. 160 miles northeast to Hen and Chickens Shoals, where the student aviators would practice bombing runs over the shallow reef area before the formation regrouped and continued north. 40 miles north from there. Then the long westward leg home, the Florida coast arriving out of the western distance as the formation crossed back over land and turned south toward the base. The chart would have lain on the table with the pencil line crossing it in 3 clear directions, and the men in the room would have studied the course the way men study a thing they expect to do and return from without incident. The Wright R2600 radial engine was a reliable unit. It had powered Avengers through the Pacific campaign across thousands of hours of operational flying over open ocean, and by December 1945, it had accumulated the particular kind of institutional confidence that comes from sustained operational use without chronic failure. The sound it made on startup was a sound the ground crew at NA's Fort Lauderdale knew well: a cough, a surge, the deepening note of the cylinders finding their rhythm as the propeller blurred through its first full rotations and the aircraft came alive around it. 5 of those engines turning over in sequence on an afternoon in December made a sound that carried across the tarmac and reached the perimeter fencing and the flat coastal scrubland beyond it. unremarkable to anyone who worked at the base, the ordinary signature of a mission beginning in the ordinary way. The TBM Avenger was a large aircraft for its era. Its 54-foot wingspan was wider than a suburban house is long, and when 5 of them sat on the tarmac apron in the flat December light of South Florida, the line they formed was long and orderly and unmistakably purposeful, the silhouette of 5 aircraft ready to fly, the practical shape of a naval air station operating at the level of routine. Their bomb bays, closed for the training mission and then opened for the practice runs over hen and chicken shoals, and closed again, operated on hydraulics that produced a specific mechanical clunk when the doors reached their locked position, a sound that was part of the pre-flight sequence and the post-run sequence and the general texture of an Avenger going through its normal operational cycle. The bomb bays on 5 aircraft closing in sequence before a training departure made 5 iterations of that sound, each one a confirmation that the aircraft was sealed and prepared, everything checked and in order. The overwater navigation routes east of Fort Lauderdale ran out over the Gulf Stream first. The warm northward current that ran close to the Florida coast before sweeping northeast into the open Atlantic, and then across the pale shallow water above the Bahamas banks, where the bottom was close enough to the surface in many places that the color of the water changed from deep blue to a translucent turquoise green that was distinctive enough to function as a navigation aid on its own. Instructors who knew the routes well knew that color change, the way the water lightened as the depth decreased above the shoals, and knew how to read the pattern of islands and cays and open water stretches below as a navigational text that supplemented the compass and the chart and the radio bearings available from stations on the Florida coast. On a clear afternoon with good visibility and the sun in the right position, the Bahamas east of Florida were navigable by visual reference to a degree that made overwater flight less demanding than it might be in other regions. December 5, 1945 was partly cloudy. The afternoon light was adequate. Navigation problem. No one was designated with a number because there were multiple standard navigation problems that student aviators at NAS Fort Lauderdale flew in sequence as part of their training. Number 1 was among the first, and in structure it was straightforward, a triangular course over water with a defined destination, a defined turning point, and a defined return route. The purpose was to give student aviators experience navigating over open water by compass bearing, airspeed, and elapsed time in the absence of the ground-based visual reference points that make overland navigation easier and more forgiving. Over open ocean, the horizon is the only constant visual reference. The water below is featureless in all directions for as far as visibility extends. The compass bearing and the clock become the primary tools, and the training was designed to build confidence and competence in their use. This was what navigation problem number 1 was for. This was what the mission was. The tarmac at NAS Fort Lauderdale in the afternoon heat of December, a mild heat by any northern measure, but warm enough that the air above the concrete shimmered slightly at the far end of the apron, reflected the afternoon light upward into the undersides of the aircraft parked there, catching the silver paint of the Avengers' bellies and throwing it back in that particular coastal Florida way, where the light seems to come from 2 directions at once, from the sky above and from the bright flat surfaces below. The salt smell off the Atlantic was present in everything at the station. It was in the fabric of the flight suits, in the metal surfaces of the aircraft that had been exposed to it for years, in the air inside the hangars when the doors were open. It was not a remarkable smell to anyone who worked there. It was simply the smell of the base, the smell of the work, the smell of the particular piece of coastline that the Navy had chosen in 1942 for the purpose of training aviators for the business of flying over water. Taylor's 2,500 hours were real hours, logged in real aircraft over real distances. Pacific combat flying was operationally demanding in ways that peacetime training flying was not, and the hours accumulated in it had a particular weight, the weight of decisions made under pressure, of navigation performed in conditions less controlled than training situations, of the sustained demand that operational flying placed on a pilot's ability to maintain situational awareness across long periods of time in a cockpit. By the measure of the hours and the experience behind them, Taylor was qualified for what he was being asked to do. The base had accepted his qualifications and assigned him to lead the mission, and the mission was, by the standards of the day, a routine one. 5 aircraft, 14 men, a triangular course over the Bahamas. The afternoon of December 5th, 1945, the student aviators aboard Flight 19 were at various stages of their training. Some of them had more hours than others. Some had flown the Bahamas routes before. Some were flying them for the first time, which was the point of the exercise, for the mission to be, for some of them, the experience of navigating over open water before they had done it many times, to let them acquire that familiarity in conditions structured enough to be safe and open enough to be genuinely instructive. Training works by doing, and what they were being asked to do on the afternoon of December 5th was navigate, which meant reading the compass, checking the heading, watching the elapsed time, and building in themselves the particular confidence of having done a thing and returned from it, having done it correctly. This was what navigation problem number 1 was designed to provide, and there was nothing in the briefing that morning to suggest it would provide anything else. The 5 Avengers were fueled for the mission. Fuel loads on a training flight were calculated against the expected route distance, with standard margins for deviation and reserve. The practical arithmetic of aviation logistics applied to a triangular course of known geometry and known length. The ground crew serviced the aircraft through the morning and into the early afternoon. Oil checked, hydraulics checked, radio equipment checked. The pre-flight inspection procedures that governed every departure from a naval air station in 1945 were thorough and documented, and there is nothing in the available record to suggest they were not followed on December 5th. The aircraft were ready. The men were briefed. The afternoon was advancing toward the departure window. What it looked and felt like to sit in the cockpit of a TBM Avenger on the tarmac at NAS Fort Lauderdale before takeoff was a particular kind of enclosed familiarity. The instrument panel with its gauges and dials arranged in the fixed geometry that a pilot, over enough hours, stops seeing as individual instruments and begins reading as a whole, a field of information that the eyes move across without conscious direction, the normal indications registering as background, and any deviation from normal standing, out the way a wrong note stands out in familiar music. The cockpit smelled of oil and fuel and the accumulated presence of many hours of flight, the particular institutional smell of an aircraft that has been used as a tool of training for years and carries in its surfaces the evidence of that use. The seat adjusted to the pilot's height. The controls responded with the familiar weight that comes from a particular aircraft's control surfaces, which is always slightly different from any other aircraft's, the specific feel of this machine, rather than the general abstraction of all machines. 14 men across 5 aircraft climbing into their cockpits in the sequence that the mission required. The specific order of boarding, who climbed into which aircraft, in what order, How the ground crew stood back as the propellers began to turn is not preserved in detail in the documents that survive. What is preserved is the outcome. At approximately 2:10 in the afternoon of December 5th, 1945, the 5 Avengers of Flight 19 departed NAS Fort Lauderdale and turned northeast over the Florida coast, climbing into a partly cloudy December sky over the Atlantic. The mission had begun. The aircraft formed up. The engines held their steady note at cruise power. Below them, the coastal water of South Florida gave way to the open Atlantic, and ahead of them, the Bahamas waited at the prescribed distance and bearing, the course drawn on the chart and reproduced now in the heading of the lead aircraft and the aircraft following it. The flat light of a Florida December afternoon at 2 in the afternoon has a particular quality, lower in the sky than summer light, angled differently, casting shadows that lean away from it at the wider angles of a season that tilts the sun toward the southern horizon. The Avengers lifting off the runway at NAS Fort Lauderdale would have cast those angled shadows across the apron as they climbed, their silhouettes rising through the shallow afternoon light. The shadow of each aircraft passing over the concrete as the wheels left the ground and the aircraft turned northeast, and the shadow fell back behind it, and the aircraft was airborne, no longer connected to the surface. 5 silhouettes rising in sequence, the engines loud in the air above the base, then fading northeast, then quieter, then gone into the ordinary ambient sound of a naval air station continuing its day. The course would take them over the Gulf Stream first, the warm blue river in the ocean, running northward a few miles off the Florida coast, its boundary visible from altitude as a shift in watercolor from the pale inshore water to the deep blue of the current itself. Beyond the Gulf Stream, the water over the Bahamas banks lightened again to that translucent green-blue that experienced navigators used as a visual landmark, the shallow bottom showing through the clear subtropical water as a wash of color against the deeper blue on either side. Hen and Chickens Shoals lay ahead at 160 miles, the practice bombing area where the student aviators would carry out the runs prescribed by the mission plan, and then the formation would collect itself and proceed north and then west and then south and home. The course was drawn, the aircraft were on it, everything was proceeding as planned. The ground crew watching the 5 Avengers climb away to the northeast would have watched them until the aircraft resolved into shapes too small to identify individually, and then into specks, and then into nothing. The sound of the engines would have followed the same sequence, present, then diminished, then absent, absorbed into the general sound of the base and the coastal air and the wind off the Atlantic. The apron would have been left in the ordinary state that a flight's departure leaves it, quieter. The spaces where the aircraft had stood, now empty, the ground crew moving to other work, the afternoon continuing. At NAS Fort Lauderdale on December 5th, 1945, navigation problem number 1 was in the air. 5 TBM, Avengers, 14 men, a triangular course over the Bahamas. The base returned to its ordinary rhythm. The flight proceeded northeast. The partly cloudy sky above the Atlantic coast received them, and for a time they flew through it on course and on schedule, everything still as it had been planned, everything still proceeding exactly as expected. The 5 silhouettes climbed northeast, the Atlantic opening beneath them, the Florida coast receding to the southwest, the pale shallow water of the Bahamas ahead. The formation held its shape. The engines held their note. The afternoon light lay across the ocean below them in the flat, wide way of December light at low angles, and the shadows of 5 Avengers moved across the water's surface far below, tracking northeast with them, growing slowly longer as the afternoon advanced and the sun continued its descent toward the southwestern horizon. The mission was in progress. The men were at their stations. The instruments read normal. Below, the ocean was wide and still, and the color of the afternoon falling across it. The practice bombing runs over hen and chicken shoals had been completed. The 5 Avengers were somewhere over the Atlantic, somewhere in that particular band of pale winter sky between the Bahamas and the open ocean, their engines running steadily, their fuel gauges reading what they were supposed to read, and the second leg of the triangular course was underway. Inside each cockpit, the instruments glowed in the way they always glowed on afternoon over-water flights. The compass needle, the altimeter, the fuel gauge arranged in their familiar positions. The ocean below, continuous and blue-gray and largely featureless in the way that open water is featureless when there is no land to give it scale or direction. The formation held its heading northeast. The afternoon was not yet alarming. What a cockpit feels like in those conditions is something the radio logs document only indirectly, through the gaps between transmissions, through the tone of the language when transmissions do come through the measured intervals of normal contact that precede anything unusual. On the second leg of navigation problem number 1, those intervals were still ordinary. The aircraft were where they were supposed to be, doing what they were supposed to do, and the November cold front that had been building to the northwest was not yet a factor. The formation would have been tracking with particular concern. The ocean below moved with its own deep indifference, its surface texture shifting with the wind, the afternoon light coming at a low angle that flattened everything beneath it into a single undifferentiated plane of gray-blue water. At approximately 3:40 p.m., the radio operator at NAA's Fort Lauderdale's control tower received a transmission from Lieutenant Taylor. The transmission was logged. What it contained was not a routine position report and not a request for updated weather information, and not any of the things that a second-leg transmission from a training flight normally contained. What Taylor reported was that both of his compasses were malfunctioning. He reported that he was not certain of the flight's position. The radio operator's pencil moved across the log sheet, recording the time and the substance of what had been said, and the entry that resulted was precise and brief in the way that official log entries are brief. The time, the call sign, the content, the notation of receipt. It was, in the language of subsequent naval investigation documents, the formal beginning of the emergency. 2 compasses failing simultaneously would have been an unusual event. The TBM Avenger carried both a magnetic compass and a gyroscopic compass, 2 independent systems designed precisely so that one could serve as a check on the other. Taylor's report that both were malfunctioning was noted by investigators reviewing the case, who observed that simultaneous failure of 2 independent compass systems would have been a highly unusual mechanical event. The Naval Board of Inquiry that convened in the weeks following the disappearance found no confirmed evidence that such a simultaneous failure had actually occurred. What the board found instead, or rather what it did not find, was a definitive explanation for why Taylor believed his compasses were wrong, and whether the instruments themselves were behaving erratically, or whether the readings they were giving were accurate but were being interpreted against a position that was itself incorrect. The position question is where the documented record becomes most interesting and most difficult to resolve. Radio signal triangulation analysis conducted after the disappearance, using the bearings obtained by ground stations, that were in contact with the flight during the emergency placed the aircraft almost certainly to the northeast of the Bahamas, over open Atlantic water, and on the Bahamas side of the Florida Peninsula. Taylor, according to the transmissions he made during the emergency period, believed the flight was over the Florida Keys. The Florida Keys lie to the southwest of Fort Lauderdale, at the opposite end of Florida Bay from the Bahamas, separated from the aircraft's probable actual position by a distance of several hundred miles. It was not a small discrepancy in an estimated position. It was a fundamental misidentification of the geographic region the flight was in. How a position error of that magnitude could develop during a navigation problem. Number 1 exercise, a standard well-documented training route that the station had run hundreds of times, is a question the investigation examined without arriving at a fully satisfying answer. One element of the record that later researchers have noted is that Taylor had only recently transferred to NAS Fort Lauderdale and had limited familiarity with its specific overwater navigation routes. The Keys versus Bahamas confusion, some analysts have suggested, may have been rooted in Taylor's more extensive experience flying similar-looking overwater environments around the Keys during earlier assignments, producing a mental model of the region that, once activated, proved difficult to correct against the incoming evidence of the compass readings and the visual appearance of the ocean below. The investigation did not establish this as a confirmed cause. It noted it as a factor worth considering. What the transmissions show in the hours that followed Taylor's 3:40 p.m. report is a flight leader working through a navigation problem with access to fragmentary information, interrupted radio contact, worsening conditions, and compasses he either could not trust or believed he could not trust. Captain Don Poole, a senior flight instructor based at Fort Lauderdale, who was monitoring the emergency communications from the ground, came into contact with Taylor during this period. Poole advised Taylor to turn west. The reasoning was direct. The sun was low on the western horizon, visible through gaps in the cloud cover, and flying toward it would bring the formation to the Florida coast, regardless of where exactly over the Atlantic they currently were. It was a sound piece of navigation advice, the kind of thing that uses a reliable fixed reference point to resolve a compass uncertainty, and Taylor acknowledged it. He acknowledged it and then did not follow it. Whether the failure to follow that advice was the result of continued spatial disorientation, of worsening radio interference that disrupted Poole's transmission before the full message was received, or of some other factor the investigation did not establish. The record shows the advice was given. The record shows the advice was acknowledged. The record shows the formation continued northeast. By 5 p.m., the light inside a cockpit flying northeast over the Atlantic would have been dimming. The sun that Poole had pointed toward was behind the aircraft, dropping toward the Florida horizon, its color shifting from white to orange in the way that a winter sun's color shifts when it is low and the air ahead of a front has thickened. The ocean surface below, which had been blue-gray in the early afternoon, was roughening. The cold front that had been building to the northwest was crossing the Florida coast and pushing east, and the water beneath the formation was beginning to show whitecaps in the troughs between the swells. The kind of sea state that does not yet look dangerous from altitude, but that has already passed the point where a ditching would be routine. Inside the cockpit, the instrument panel still glowed, the altimeter still read. The fuel gauges were reading things that were now demanding attention. At approximately 5:15 p.m., Taylor transmitted that the flight would head west. The transmission also contained information about fuel. Taylor reported that fuel was becoming critically low, a statement consistent with the elapsed time of the flight and the fuel capacity of the TBM Avenger, which carried sufficient fuel for roughly 5.5 hours of flying under normal conditions. The flight had departed at approximately 2:10 p.m. By 5:15 p.m., 3 hours and 5 minutes had elapsed. The remaining fuel margin was narrowing in whatever position the aircraft were actually in, northeast of the Bahamas, as the triangulation evidence suggests. A westward heading toward Florida represented the correct general direction. The transmission was logged at Fort Lauderdale. Ground controllers attempted to establish clear two-way communication in response. What the logs record in the interval that followed is an increasing proportion of entries noting interference, noting partial reception, noting that responses had been sent, but that confirmation of receipt from the aircraft was not obtainable. The atmospheric conditions that a December cold front produces over the western Atlantic are not unusual, but they are not benign to radio communication either. The front was generating precipitation, gusty winds, and the kind of electrically unstable air that introduces static into radio signals. The frequency that Flight 19 was using was also being used by a commercial aircraft that evening, producing overlapping transmissions that ground controllers had difficulty sorting from one another. The increasing distance of the formation from Fort Lauderdale as the aircraft continued northeast through the afternoon and into the early evening further reduced signal strength. Each of these factors is individually documented in the investigation records. Together they produced a communications environment in which ground controllers and the flight were increasingly unable to exchange reliable information, a condition that, once established, became self-reinforcing because the flight was unable to receive the position corrections it needed, and the ground was unable to confirm that the corrections it was sending were being received. What the radio log at Fort Lauderdale shows across the late afternoon hours is a sequence of entries becoming briefer and more spaced. The 3:40 p.m. entry has a density of detail that reflects a transmission received clearly enough to transcribe. The entries that follow become progressively terser, partial phrases, signal strength notations, entries logging attempted transmissions without acknowledgement of receipt. The handwriting in which the log is kept does not change. The page continues to fill with the same careful notation of time and content that it carried through the earlier hours of the afternoon. Only the content itself becomes thinner, less information per entry, more entries noting the absence of clear contact. It is a record of a communication channel narrowing entry by entry across the hours of the afternoon. The NAS Banana River Station, located on the Florida East Coast south of Cape Canaveral, was also monitoring the emergency frequencies during this period. Banana River's position gave it a different angle on the signals coming from the area of the Atlantic where the flight was believed to be operating, and its log records the same pattern of intermittent, increasingly difficult contact. The triangulation bearings that investigators later used to reconstruct the flight's probable position were partly derived from the Banana River Station's reception data, cross-referenced against bearings obtained from other ground stations that were receiving the flight's transmissions during this period. The triangulation was not definitive enough to establish the flight's position with certainty, but it was consistent enough to place the aircraft northeast of the Bahamas rather than over the Keys. At approximately 7:04 p.m., NAS Banana River received a transmission attributed to Flight 19. The log entry describes the transmission as broken and unreadable. The exact content could not be transcribed. The signal strength was insufficient to allow two-way communication. What the log records is the fact of a transmission received, the time, the assessment of its quality, and the notation that the content was not recoverable. After that entry, the log continues. The notation of time moves forward. The entries that follow the 7:04 p.m. line document the ground station's continued attempts to raise the flight. They document the silence that met those attempts. They document the formal notification of the base commander and the initiation of search procedures. The page remains exactly as it was kept. The column of times, the column of notes, the handwriting steady and consistent throughout, recording what was there and what was not there, with equal care and equal plainness. Outside the operations buildings at Nahas Banana River, the night was fully dark by 7:04 p.m. The Atlantic coast of Florida in early December is dark by 6 in the evening, and an hour past that, the night had settled completely over the coast and over the water beyond it. The cold front was across the area now, its winds steady and gusty, the cloud cover thick enough to eliminate the stars and whatever moonlight might otherwise have reached the water's surface. The sea in the area where the flight was believed to be operating was running rough, 4 to 6 feet of swell, the meteorological records show, with whitecaps and spray across the troughs. Under those conditions, in that light, the ocean surface was not something that could be visually inspected from the shore or from another aircraft at any useful distance. It was simply dark water. The search procedures that were initiated in the hour following the 7:04 p.m. entry were documented at Banana River and at Fort Lauderdale simultaneously. The decision-making that unfolded in those procedures is part of the investigation record. What the record shows is an institution responding to the loss of contact with a training flight by doing exactly what its protocols called for, notifying appropriate authority, initiating contact with available search assets, beginning to document the timeline and the nature of the emergency for the investigation that would follow. The protocols existed because overwater navigation emergencies were not unprecedented, and the Naval Aviation System of 1945 had procedures in place for managing them. Those procedures were followed. The outcome they were designed to address, the recovery of the aircraft, or the location of the crew, is the part of the record that the subsequent days would determine. The flight of approximately 3 hours and 55 minutes from the 3:40 p.m. transmission to the 7:04 p.m. final entry at Banana River covers a span of time during which a great deal of documented contact occurred, and none of it resolved the position confusion that Taylor had reported at the beginning. The radio logs from Fort Lauderdale and Banana River together constitute a record of what was communicated and what was not, what advice was offered and not followed, what information was requested and not obtained, what transmissions were logged as received, and what responses went unacknowledged. There is enough in the record to trace the shape of the emergency as it developed. There is not enough to establish definitively where the aircraft were when fuel finally became critical, which direction they were flying in the final hour, or what the last condition of the formation was. The triangulation data, placed against the weather records and the fuel calculations, suggests a probable area of the Atlantic northeast of the Bahamas, where the aircraft may have run out of fuel at some point in the late evening of December 5th. That area encompasses a considerable range of ocean. The Gulf Stream runs through portions of it, moving northward through the Straits of Florida at 4 to 5 miles per hour, a current with enough volume and velocity to move floating debris a substantial distance in a short period. The search that began in the hours after the final transmission would address those questions in the days that followed, and the search's findings, or rather the particular nature of what the search did not find, are part of what the record preserves. The log page at Nahas Banana River that holds the 7:04 p.m. entry does not end at 7:04. It continues. The times after that entry record the attempts to raise Flight 19 that were made through the evening, the regular intervals of attempted contact, the notation of silence received in response, the progressive formal documentation of a flight that had not answered and had not returned. The handwriting remains the same. The column of times advances in the same increments. The radio operator at Banana River, keeping that log, was doing exactly the same thing at 9 p.m. that he had been doing at 7:04, maintaining the record, noting what was there, noting what was not there, continuing the log for as long as the procedures required. There is something in that kind of documentation that is worth staying with for a moment. The log does not change its character when the emergency becomes a disappearance. It does not become more urgent in its notation or more expressive in its language. It records the 7:04 p.m. transmission in the same format that it recorded the earlier transmissions, and it records the silence after it in the same format that it recorded the noise before it. Official records are like that. They maintain their form regardless of what they contain, and that maintenance of form is itself a kind of information. The absence of any special notation at 7:04 p.m., the continuation of the log in its ordinary format past the last entry, attributable to Flight 19, communicates something about the nature of how that kind of absence arrives. Not with a different kind of handwriting, not with a different kind of entry, simply with the same entry format, continued forward in time, and the content of the entries changing from partial reception to no reception, from something to nothing, in the ordinary progress of the page. The cold front that had been moving across the area all afternoon continued east through the night of December 5th. By midnight, the western Atlantic, in the area where the flight was believed to have been operating, was under overcast skies, with seas running higher than they had been at 7:04 p.m. The temperature had dropped several degrees from its afternoon reading. The ocean surface was dark and wind-roughened and indistinguishable from the sky above it at any distance greater than a few hundred feet. Whatever the five Avengers had become in those hours since 7:04, and the record does not say, because the record does not know. The ocean that covered those hours was dark and cold and moving, and it was the ocean that the search vessels would arrive to cover in the morning. The last entry in the Banana River log that is attributable to Flight 19, the 7:04 p.m. transmission, broken and unreadable, sits on its page in an archive now, in the same format as every other entry on that page, surrounded by the entries that preceded it and followed it in the normal progress of the log. The entries that follow it document the attempts to make contact that the station continued through the evening. They document the responses that did not come. They document the formal notifications made and the search procedures initiated. The page is full. The record is complete. What it is complete with is both what happened and what did not happen, the transmission that arrived and the transmission that did not follow it, and the silence that the log simply continued past, entry by entry, into the night. The radio log at Fort Lauderdale and the radio log at Banana River together span the full emergency period from 3:40 p.m. to past 7 p.m. They contain the documented substance of what is known about the last hours of Flight 19's contact with the ground. They do not contain everything that would be needed to explain what happened, the actual positions of the aircraft at each point in time, the internal state of the navigation, the precise fuel situation at each stage of the flight. They contain what a radio log contains: the times, the signals received, the signals sent, the quality of reception, the content where content was recoverable. What happened to the 5 aircraft after the log's last entry remains in the category of what the record holds open rather than what it resolves. That openness is not a failure of the record. It is a feature of the kind of event the record is documenting, an event that reached its conclusion in a place and at a time when no documentation was being kept, beyond the ocean's own slow way of recording what moves through it and what does not. The cold front moved east. The Gulf Stream moved north. The night of December 5th moved into the early morning of December 6th. The log at NAS Banana River moved from 7:04 p.m. forward through the hours that followed, and the page where the last entry sits remains in its archive, still open, the record continuing past the silence, in the same measured column of times, as complete as any record can be of something it did not have words enough to finish. At Nas Banana River, on the Florida coast, at approximately 7:27 in the evening on December 5, 1945, a decision was entered into the operations log. A PBM Mariner flying boat, designated Training 49, had been assigned to search. The aircraft was crewed by 13 men. The log recorded the time. The aircraft was readied, the crew boarded, and Training 49 lifted off the dark water of the Banana River and climbed into an overcast sky that had by then fully swallowed the last of the afternoon light. The PBM Mariner was a large twin-engine flying boat built for long overwater patrols, its hull designed to land and take off from open water, its range sufficient for hours of search coverage across wide ocean. Training 49 was one of the type. It departed with its 13 crew members into the night above the Florida coast, bearing northeast toward the area from which Flight 19's transmissions had last been received, and it did not return. It did not send a distress signal. It produced no record of what it encountered. The aircraft and its crew were simply gone, the way a signal stops, without a final entry to mark the moment. What followed came approximately 23 minutes after Training 49's departure. At around 7:50 in the evening, crew members aboard the USS Solomons, operating in the area, reported witnessing a sudden large explosion in the sky. The light of it was visible from the ship's deck. What followed the explosion was a burning debris field on the surface of the water, oil spreading outward, material scattered across the waves, the surface lit by burning fuel. The position of this observed explosion was consistent with the flight path. Training 49 would have been following. The USS Solomon's crew's account was corroborated by the crew of the SS Gaines Mills, a merchant vessel also in the area, which reported observing oil slicks and debris floating at a position that matched the Solomon's observation. No personnel were recovered. No bodies were found. The debris field marked the place where Training 49 had been, and then the ocean continued, and the night continued, and the search that Training 49 had been launched to conduct was now the search that would have to account for Training 49 as well. The PBM Mariner had a known characteristic that naval personnel were familiar with. The aircraft type had earned an informal designation among those who flew and serviced it, the flying gas tank. The name was not affectionate. The Mariner's fuel system carried a documented susceptibility to vapor ignition, a tendency for fuel vapors to accumulate in spaces where a spark, a mechanical fault, or a shift in pressure could produce exactly the kind of catastrophic, instantaneous explosion the crew of the USS Solomons described from the deck of their ship on the night of December 5th. Investigators reviewing Training 49's probable fate would note this characteristic. It offered a framework, not a certainty, but a framework for understanding how a large crewed search aircraft could produce a sudden fireball in the sky, without a distress call, without a warning transmission, without the kind of graduated deterioration that gives a crew time to report what is happening. If the ignition came first, Nothing followed it. The log at Nas Banana River simply held the departure entry, and the line beneath it remained empty. 13 names were added to the record of December 5th. The crew of Training 49, 13 men who had gone out to search for 14 others, were gone before anyone on the ground fully understood that a second disaster had compounded the first. The search that had been organized around Flight 19 now had to reorganize itself around a broader and more complicated silence. 27 men had departed the Florida coast since early that afternoon, and none of them had come back. The decision to mount a full search was made, and the scale of what followed was, by any measure, enormous. Naval history to that point had not often seen a peacetime maritime search of the dimensions that assembled itself in the hours and days after December 5th. The morning of December 6th brought aircraft into the air in numbers that are worth holding still for a moment to consider. More than 300 aircraft were eventually committed to the search operation, a figure that, laid against the gray Atlantic winter horizon, produces an image of organized, purposeful effort at a scale rarely applied to a peacetime mystery. The ocean was to be covered. Every available resource would be directed toward it. Those 300 aircraft spread outward from the Florida coast in overlapping search patterns, their grids drawn across the ocean in systematic coverage that attempted to account for both the last known position of Flight 19's transmissions and the dispersal dynamics of open water wreckage over time. 21 Navy vessels joined the search. 4 Coast Guard vessels operated alongside them. Dozens of private boats were incorporated into the effort, their smaller hulls working closer in sections of the coast and shallower areas where a larger vessel could not maneuver efficiently. The total search area covered in the days that followed has been documented at approximately 250,000 square miles, a measurement that requires some pause to actually feel. 250,000 square miles of Atlantic Ocean, scanned from the air and from the surface, in the winter water off Florida and in the Bahamas and in the waters between them for approximately 5 days. Search vessels worked systematic patterns. Crews at the rails of those ships raised binoculars and scanned the surface, looking for the oil slick that marks an aircraft going into the water, or the debris field that marks a ditching, or the survival equipment that marks men who made it down and were waiting for recovery. The Gulf Stream ran beneath them, moving northward through the Straits of Florida at 4 to 5 miles per hour, carrying its enormous volume of warm equatorial water steadily northeast into the open Atlantic. Anything that had entered the ocean in or near the Gulf Stream's path would already be moving. It would already be dispersing. The search knew this and accounted for it as best a search can, expanding the grids, pushing the patterns northeast to follow where the current would take wreckage, and found nothing that could be identified as belonging to Flight 19 or to Training 49. 5 days of searching across 250,000 square miles returned nothing attributable to the 5 Avengers or their 14 men. The ocean gave back no wreckage, no survival equipment, no personal effects, no aircraft components that could be matched to the specific tail designations FT-28, FT-36, FT-3, FT-117, FT-81 that had departed NAS Fort Lauderdale the afternoon before. Portions of an Avenger were later located in different searches over the years, in waters in the general region, but none could be definitively linked to Flight 19's specific aircraft. The search for Training 49's crew produced only what the USS Solomons and the SS Gaines Mills had already observed: the debris field from the explosion, which was consistent with the mariners' documented fuel vulnerability, and which left nothing behind that told the search anything about what Training 49 had or had not found in the final minutes before the explosion. What the crew of 13 knew, they kept. The search stood down. The vessels made their final passes. The aircraft flew their final grids. The ocean surface was wide and gray and winter cold, and the Gulf Stream moved beneath it, and nothing came up. The U.S. Navy Board of Inquiry convened to investigate what had happened. Boards of inquiry are formal bodies, their procedures careful, and their findings recorded with the precision appropriate to official institutional conclusions. The board gathered testimony, reviewed the documented radio transmissions, examined weather records, considered the sequence of events as it could be reconstructed from the logs at NAS Fort Lauderdale and NAS Banana River, and worked toward a finding. The initial finding attributed the loss of Flight 19 to pilot error on the part of Lieutenant Taylor, specifically to the navigational confusion that the radio transmissions had documented so clearly. The position error that had placed the flight northeast over the Bahamas, while Taylor believed it to be somewhere southwest over the Florida Keys. The decisions that had followed from that error as fuel diminished and the weather worsened and the radio communications became increasingly fragmentary and then stopped. Taylor's family contested the finding. The attribution of pilot error to a man whose remains had not been recovered and who could not speak to his own account of what had happened was a finding his family held as both premature and unjust, given the documented circumstances, the compass malfunction Taylor had reported, the weather that had moved into the area, the radio interference that had degraded his ability to receive and act on guidance from the ground. The Board of Inquiry's initial finding was formally amended. The amended classification that replaced it was entered into the record and has remained there since. 2 words, cause unknown. Those 2 words carry a particular weight in the context of a formal naval investigation. The Board of Inquiry has access to every piece of documentation the institution can produce: the radio logs, the weather records, the witness testimony, the technical analysis of the aircraft and their systems, the accounts from every ship and aircraft involved in the search. It has access to experts, it has procedural authority, and at the end of all of that, the formal finding for the loss of 5 aircraft and 14 men was cause unknown, not pilot error, not mechanical failure, not weather, not the Gulf Stream, or the darkness, or the compass, or the cold front, or the radio interference, or any combination of factors that could be established with the certainty the institution required to call something a cause. Unknown. The case file received that classification and remained open, the way a question remains open when the evidence available does not yet reach an answer. The amended finding did not diminish the scale of the search that had been mounted or the thoroughness of the investigation that followed it. More than 300 aircraft, 21 Navy vessels, 4 Coast Guard vessels, dozens of private boats, 250,000 square miles, 5 days, and then the formal conclusion of the institution that had organized all of that effort, cause unknown. The gap between the scale of the response and the sparseness of the conclusion is itself part of what the record holds, a documented disproportion between what was expended and what was found, which the archive preserves without resolving. It is worth staying with the image of the search for a moment longer. 300 aircraft spreading outward from the Florida coast at dawn on December 6th, their engines audible over the gray winter water, their search patterns overlapping in systematic grids that tried to leave no significant area uncovered, represent an organized human effort at a considerable scale. The crews of those aircraft and those vessels were looking carefully. They were trained for exactly this kind of work. The search was not careless or abbreviated. It was large, and it was sustained, and it was thorough within the limits of what any search can be across 250,000 square miles of open Atlantic in December. A search vessel, working a grid pattern in the Gulf Stream, moves through water that is itself moving. The ocean beneath the hull is not stationary. The Gulf Stream's northward drift means that a search grid plotted at noon describes a different volume of water by evening because the water itself has moved. The crews understood this. The search patterns attempted to account for it. And still, across those 5 days in that enormous area, the ocean returned nothing that closed the record. The search found what the search found, which is to say, the debris field from Training 49's explosion, observed but not recovered in any form that answered the deeper questions, and the rest of the area produced nothing at all. The cold front that had moved through the Bermuda Triangle region on the afternoon and evening of December 5th had, by the time the search began in earnest on the morning of the 6th, already passed. The weather on December 6th was not, by most accounts, the same rough, reduced visibility, gusty wind weather that had been developing as Flight 19's final transmissions were received. The search went out into conditions that had calmed somewhat from the previous evening's deterioration. This is part of what the record holds. The worst weather was present during the hours of Flight 19's final transmissions and Training 49's departure and destruction, and had eased by the time the full search was underway. What the search found, or did not find, is therefore not entirely explained by the weather that had been present during the events themselves. The 13 crew members of Training 49 are part of the documented disaster of December 5th, in a way that is sometimes less central to popular accounts than the 14 airmen of Flight 19, perhaps because Flight 19 is the event that anchored the larger cultural narrative that followed. But the 13 men of Training 49 who boarded their aircraft at NAS Banana River at 7:27 in the evening to go out and search for people who had not come back are present in the record with equal clarity. Their names are in the naval documents. Their aircraft's departure time is logged. The explosion that ended their flight was witnessed and reported by the crews of 2 vessels and corroborated across accounts, 27 men in all, across one December evening in 1945. None of them recovered. The investigation's work was careful and extended across a considerable period. The Board of Inquiry reviewed testimony from personnel at NAS Fort Lauderdale, from the ground controllers who had monitored and attempted to guide Flight 19's final hours, from the radio operators who had transcribed the transmissions as they arrived and deteriorated and finally stopped. It reviewed the technical specifications of the TBM Avenger, its systems and their known failure modes, the characteristics of the Wright R2600 engine, the fuel load carried on the afternoon's mission, and the rate at which that fuel would have been consumed across the hours of extended flight that Taylor's position confusion had introduced. It reviewed weather records for the region. It reviewed the Gulf Stream's behavior and the dispersal dynamics of ocean wreckage. All of this produced cause unknown. There are aspects of the case that the investigation found genuinely difficult to resolve. Taylor's report of dual compass malfunction, both his compasses behaving erratically simultaneously, was, by the analysis of the investigating board, an unusual and not easily explained technical event. Simultaneous failure of 2 separate compass systems in the same aircraft would, under normal circumstances, be a rare occurrence. The board noted this. It did not resolve it. Taylor reported what he reported, and the radio logs preserved those transmissions, and the question of whether both compasses genuinely failed simultaneously or whether something else produced the reported symptoms remained part of the unresolved record. The position error, the belief that the flight was over the Florida Keys when it was almost certainly northeast over the Bahamas, is the navigational pivot around which the rest of the disaster turns. It is documented in the transmissions themselves, in Taylor's expressed uncertainty, in Captain Poole's advice from the ground to turn west toward the setting sun, in the flight's apparent failure to follow that advice consistently. The position error is not by itself inexplicable. Overwater navigation without reliable compass function, in deteriorating visibility, with radio interference compromising the quality of guidance being received from the ground, produces conditions in which position errors of significant magnitude are possible. The investigation found this. It did not find a mechanism that made the position error certain, or that fully accounted for why it went uncorrected once ground control was attempting to guide the flight toward the Florida coast. The record holds the events. It holds the transmissions. It does not fully account for the gap between what Taylor was told and what the flight did. 300 aircraft searched, 21 Navy vessels, 4 Coast Guard vessels, dozens of private boats, 250,000 square miles, over 5 days, and the ocean did not answer. The Gulf Stream moved northward at 4 miles per hour and continued northward, and the Atlantic was the Atlantic, and the search eventually stood down, and the Board of Inquiry eventually reached its amended conclusion, and the file received the words "cause unknown" and was closed, in the administrative sense that a file is closed when no further active investigation is underway, but not in the sense that the case was resolved or that the question it contained was answered. A case file closed for lack of evidence is not the same as a case file closed because the evidence found was sufficient. The cause unknown classification acknowledges the difference. It holds the distinction between what the investigation found and what the investigation would have needed to find in order to say something more precise. The search for wreckage from Flight 19 has been ongoing in various forms since 1945. Avenger wreckage has been located in the waters of the region in the decades since, fragments, components, sections of airframe, but the process of definitively identifying specific wreckage as belonging to a specific tail designation requires a match between serial numbers or markings on the recovered material and the documented tail codes of the 5 aircraft that departed on December 5th. FT-28, FT-36, FT-3, FT-117, FT-81. The water off Florida is not empty of aviation wreckage. The region saw considerable military aviation activity across the years of the Second World War and after, and Avenger fragments located in those waters are not automatically associated with Flight 19 without specific identifying evidence. None of the wreckage located in searches since 1945 has produced that identification with certainty. The 5 aircraft remain, in the record, unrecovered. The search operation that assembled on the morning of December 6th and worked across the following days was, at the time, one of the largest peacetime naval search efforts mounted to that point. This is a documented characterization that the scale of the numbers supports. 300 aircraft, 21 vessels, the equivalent spatial coverage of a substantial portion of the Atlantic coast. Search operations of this scale in peacetime were not common. The Navy mounted it because the loss of 14 men and 5 aircraft followed immediately by the loss of 13 more men and a second aircraft represented a disaster of a kind that demanded a proportionate response. The response was proportionate, and the ocean returned nothing that resolved the case. At the National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific in Honolulu, Hawaii, there are walls. They are called the Walls of the Missing. The names recorded on those walls are the names of service members whose remains were never recovered, men and women who died in the service of the United States military and whose bodies the ocean or the land or the air did not give back. Among the thousands of names on those walls are the names of the 14 airmen of Flight 19 and the 13 crew members of Training 49. They are there in the way that the official record places them, engraved in stone, set into the curved surfaces of the walls, the Hawaiian light moving across the inscriptions as the day moves through its hours, the names present and legible and permanent. It is a particular kind of memorial, one specifically designed for the condition of irresolution, for the situation in which there are no remains to enter, no specific location to mark with a gravestone, no burial site to visit. The walls of the missing acknowledge this condition formally, architecturally, institutionally. They say, in the language of permanent stone, these people were here, they served, they did not come back, they were not recovered, and their names are preserved. The 27 names from December 5th, 1945, are part of that larger accounting. They exist in the record at two levels simultaneously, in the case file at the Navy Archives with its cause unknown classification, and in the stone of the walls of the missing in Honolulu, where the question of cause is not the point, and the names are simply the names. The search vessels made their final passes across the search area before standing down. The aircraft flew their last grids. The binoculars came down from the rails. The ocean surface was what it was, wide and gray and moving, the Gulf Stream running steadily beneath the winter swells, carrying its enormous volume of water northward into the open Atlantic. The search had been thorough. The search had been large. The search had found what the Gulf Stream, in the December weather and 250,000 square miles of open ocean permitted it to find, which was not enough to resolve what had happened, or where the aircraft had gone, or what the 14 men of Flight 19 and the 13 crew members of Training 49 had encountered in the hours and minutes before all contact was lost. The amended Board of Inquiry findings sits in the Naval Archive. The manila folder contains all of it, the radio logs from Fort Lauderdale and Banana River, the weather records, the witness testimony from the search vessels, the technical analysis of the Avenger's systems and the mariner's fuel characteristics, the accounts of the USS Solomon's crew, describing the explosion in the night sky, the SS Gaines Mills crew's corroboration of the debris field, the fuel calculations and the dispersal estimates, and the search patterns, and the final stand-down orders. Everything the investigation gathered is in there. And on the final page of the official finding, typed in the careful institutional language of a Navy Board of Inquiry, cause unknown. The Gulf Stream was running northward that night, and it has continued running northward every night since. It carries 30 million cubic meters of water per second through the Straits of Florida and northeast into the open Atlantic. It is warm and wide and continuous, one of the great persistent currents of the ocean, moving at 4 to 5 miles per hour, and anything that entered it, in or near its path, in December of 1945, would have traveled a very long way in the 79 years between that evening and now. The ocean is not a closed system. It does not hold things still and wait to be searched. It moves, it disperses, it carries. And what it carries far and spreads wide. And the surface that the search vessels scanned in December of 1945 is not the same surface that exists now. And the water that was present then has been to the North Atlantic and back through the circulation of the deep ocean and through the years, and the 5 aircraft and the 27 men are held in a record that acknowledges in its final line that what the ocean keeps It keeps without explanation. The search stood down. The ocean continued. The case file remained open in the only honest sense, the sense in which cause unknown is not a closing, but a holding, a formal acknowledgement that the record exists, the question exists, and the institution has set down everything it found, and the folder is there, in the archive, still. The Gulf Stream moves. The walls in Honolulu hold the names. The case file holds the log. And the Atlantic, wide and indifferent and still full of December, continues north. Vincent Gaddis sat down to write in the winter of 1963, working toward a deadline for the February 1964 issue of Argosy, magazine. And somewhere in the composition of that article he wrote two words together for the first time in print, Bermuda Triangle, drawing a pencil shape across the western Atlantic that would become one of the most recognized geographic outlines in popular culture, not because the shape corresponded to any administrative boundary or geological feature, but simply because a journalist had named it, and naming a thing has a way of making it feel inevitable. The triangular region Gaddis defined was bounded by 3 points: Miami on the Florida coast, the island of Bermuda far out in the Atlantic, and the island of Puerto Rico to the southeast. The interior of that shape, roughly 500,000 square miles of open ocean, reef, and deep water, became, in the article's framing, a zone of anomalous loss. Ships had vanished there. Aircraft had gone down without explanation. The disappearances, Gaddis argued, were too numerous and too strange to be accounted for by ordinary maritime hazard alone. The article was titled The Deadly Bermuda Triangle. It ran to several pages. It was widely read. Gaddis expanded the material the following year into a book, Invisible Horizons, True Mysteries of the Sea, published in 1965, and the triangular designation migrated from magazine page to hardcover, from a single article's framing device into something more durable. The name was simple. The shape was clear. The implication that something about this particular region of ocean produced losses that defied ordinary explanation was compelling in a way that resisted easy argument. Once the triangle had been named and the name had circulated, the disappearances it claimed as evidence began to arrange themselves around it with the gravity of an established fact. What Gaddis did not note, and what would matter enormously to investigators who came later, was that a number of the cases he cited had occurred in weather conditions or navigational circumstances fully sufficient to explain the loss, that some had occurred well outside the triangular boundary he had drawn, and that the Atlantic as a whole, the Gulf of Mexico, the North Sea, the South China Sea, produced disappearances at rates that, when adjusted for traffic volume, were not substantially different from the stretch of water between Miami and Bermuda and Puerto Rico. The triangle was real as a name. Its anomalous character was considerably less certain. The losses that predated Gaddis's coinage were real, though. They existed in the record long before anyone had thought to draw a triangle around them, and they were genuinely strange in the way that maritime history is often strange, which is to say they involved large vessels, experienced crews, and open ocean, and they left nothing that could be used to explain what had happened. The USS Cyclops left Barbados in early March 1918, loaded with 10,800 tons of manganese ore and carrying 309 crew members and passengers, bound for Baltimore. She was a Proteus-class Navy collier, a large, blunt-hulled cargo vessel, photographed at dock before her departure, with her crew visible on deck in Navy uniform, her hull riding low in the water under the weight of the oar. She sent no distress signal. She arrived at no port. Search efforts found no wreckage, no oil slick, No debris, no floating material of any kind that could be attributed to her. The largest non-combat loss of life in United States Navy history was accomplished by the ocean returning absolutely nothing to account for it. The year was 1918. The word Bermuda Triangle did not exist. The Cyclops simply sailed and then was not there anymore, and the Navy looked for her and could not find what had become of her. Various explanations have been offered in the century since. Structural failure under the weight of the oar, a rogue wave in the open Atlantic, enemy action, though no enemy vessel claimed responsibility, a sudden catastrophic shift of the cargo in rough weather. None of these has been established. The Cyclops remains in the record as a ship that left port with 309 people aboard and was not seen again. The question of what happened to her, preserved exactly as it was in March of 1918, still unanswered. What that case illustrates quietly, without any need for a triangular framework, is that the Western Atlantic has always been capable of swallowing large vessels completely, leaving no recoverable trace in conditions that may have been entirely ordinary. The ocean's capacity for this is not anomalous. It is simply the ocean. The mystery of the Cyclops is real, and it does not require a named zone to explain why it has not been resolved. 3 years after the Cyclops vanished, a different kind of disappearance occurred. Not a vessel lost at sea, but a vessel found aground with everyone gone. On the morning of January 31st, 1921, the 5-masted commercial schooner Carol Deering was spotted aground on Diamond Shoals off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. Her hull tilted on the shoal, her sails still set, the Cape Hatteras lighthouse visible in the distance across the gray winter water. The lightship crew who first observed her sent a signal that received no response. When a boarding party finally reached her several days later, the weather having prevented immediate access, they found the vessel completely abandoned. The galley stove had food still cooking on it. The crew's personal belongings were in their quarters. The ship's anchors had been lowered in a manner suggesting an emergency stop. The lifeboats were gone. There was no sign of the 11 men who had crewed her. The Carol Deering had sailed from Barbados, bound for Norfolk, Virginia. She had been observed at the Cape Fear lightship on January 29th, when an unidentified crew member was reported to have called out that the ship had lost her anchors and asked the lightship to notify her owners, an unusual communication, its meaning not entirely clear. 2 days later, she was aground on Diamond Shoals, with the food still warm and the men simply absent. The abandonment was investigated formally by the U.S. State Department, the Navy, and the Coast Guard, 3 separate agencies, working through the evidence and producing no satisfactory explanation. The leading hypotheses included mutiny, piracy, a waterspout, or severe weather event that swept the crew overboard, and an encounter with rum runners operating in the area during Prohibition. None of these was established. The State Department investigation ran for several years before the case was quietly closed without a finding. The Carol Deering was not inside any named triangle when she was found. She was off Cape Hatteras, which is not Miami, or Bermuda, or Puerto Rico, but she was in the Western Atlantic, and she was strange, and she contributed to the atmosphere of accumulated maritime mystery from which the triangle legend would eventually draw its authority. Cases like the Cyclops and the Carol Deering existed in the historical record for decades, documented in naval archives and maritime investigation files, without any particular geographic framework to organize them. They were mysteries, genuine, unresolved, held in the files of government agencies that had done their best to explain them and could not. Then Gaddis drew his triangle, and they became triangle cases. retroactively admitted to a named zone that had not existed when they occurred, and the mystery of each individual disappearance was folded into the broader suggestion that the region itself was somehow responsible. This is not a trivial distinction. A vessel lost in the North Atlantic during a winter storm is a maritime tragedy. A vessel lost in the Bermuda Triangle is something else, something that carries the implication of regional anomaly, of a zone where the normal rules do not apply. The cases did not change when the triangle was named. The framing changed, and framing, as it turned out, was almost everything. Gaddis's article was read, and then his book was read, and the concept moved through popular culture at the pace at which ideas moved in the mid-1960s. Slowly at first, then not slowly at all. Other writers took up the triangle, adding cases, extending the geographic claim, searching the historical record for additional disappearances that could be assigned to the zone. The story grew, it accumulated. By the early 1970s, the Bermuda Triangle had established itself as a persistent feature of popular consciousness, a place where ships and aircraft disappeared in ways that conventional explanation could not fully account for, a named zone of anomaly sitting off the southeastern coast of the United States, available to anyone who wanted to think about it. Then Charles Berlitz published his book, and the triangle became something of an entirely different order. And the Bermuda Triangle asterisk appeared in 1974. Charles Berlitz was a linguist and writer with a talent for popular narrative, and the book he produced was accessible, dramatic, and built from an enormous accumulation of disappearance cases that seemed to thread together to constitute an overwhelming pattern of regional anomaly. The book sold more than 20 million copies. It was translated into multiple languages. It was stacked in bookstore windows across the United States and Europe, the title lettered boldly across a cover that conveyed the blue-black depth of open ocean, and it was handed across counters to readers who had never heard the word Gaddis and had not known that anyone had been thinking carefully about this stretch of water since 1964. The cases Berlitz assembled ranged from the documented to the embellished to the entirely fabricated, though readers encountering the book for the first time had no easy way to distinguish among these categories. The book incorporated theories that extended well beyond the navigational and meteorological. Magnetic anomalies were proposed. Unusual electromagnetic fields were suggested. The theory that the region sat above the ruins of the lost continent of Atlantis, specifically above a complex of Atlantean crystal energy conductors, still functioning on the ocean floor, was given extended treatment. Alien abduction was floated as a possible explanation for disappearances in which no wreckage was found. Dimensional portals, time distortions, and the intervention of non-human intelligences were all given space in Berlitz's text. These theories are documented contents of a book that sold 20 million copies. They are part of the cultural history of the Bermuda Triangle. They do not represent the current state of any relevant scientific field, and they were not well supported by evidence when Berlitz presented them, but they were widely read, and reading them across 200 pages of accumulated case material, each case reinforcing the atmosphere of inexplicability built by the cases before it, produced in many readers a conviction that something genuinely anomalous was occurring in this region of the Atlantic. The book was enormously effective as a reading experience. Its evidential basis was another matter entirely. What Berlitz had done, and this is worth holding carefully because it is the mechanism by which the legend was constructed, was select cases for inclusion based on their strangeness and omit context that might have explained them and place them inside a geographic boundary that was itself a journalist's framing device, rather than a scientifically established anomaly zone. The triangle, in Berlitz's treatment became self-reinforcing. The more cases were assigned to it, the more anomalous it seemed. The more anomalous it seemed, the more cases were assigned to it. The boundary moved when cases near its edge needed to be included. The legend expanded to fit what the legend required. The book's Flight 19 chapter was particularly influential. The loss of the 5 Avengers on December 5, 1945, was presented in terms that transformed a documented navigational emergency into something more portentous, an inexplicable vanishing. The radio transmissions stripped of their navigational confusion and rendered instead as evidence of something beyond ordinary accident. The 14 men of Flight 19, whose disappearance was fully consistent with the documented weather, the compass malfunction, the fuel state, and the Gulf Stream dynamics of that afternoon and evening, became in Berlitz's account the defining emblems of the triangle's power. The case was real. The framing was not. 20 million copies of that framing circulated through the culture. The Flight 19 disappearance became, for readers of the Berlitz book, inseparable from the triangle's supposed anomalous character. The documented explanation, navigational disorientation, fuel exhaustion, deteriorating weather, the Gulf Stream dispersing the wreckage, was simply not part of the story as Berlitz told it. The year after Berlitz's book appeared, a librarian and pilot at Arizona State University named Lawrence David Couchet published a different kind of book. Couchet had begun his investigation because his library patrons kept asking him for materials about the Bermuda Triangle, and in attempting to help them, he had gone to the primary sources, the naval investigation records, the Coast Guard incident reports, the Lloyd's insurance records, the newspaper accounts from the dates the disappearances were supposed to have occurred, and had found something that the popular accounts had systematically failed to mention. The cases, when investigated in their original documentation, rather than in the accounts Gaddis and Berlitz had made of them, looked substantially different. Asterisk, The Bermuda Triangle Mystery, Solved Asterisk, was published in 1975. The title was, perhaps slightly stronger than the findings warranted, but the findings themselves were significant. Couchet's copy of the Berlitz book, open on his library desk at Arizona State University, had margins dense with annotations, each one keyed to a Coast Guard file, or a naval record, or a newspaper account that told a different story than the one Berlitz had told. The stack of primary documents beside it was considerable, the physical apparatus of a librarian's investigation, methodical, unhurried, following the cases back to their actual documentation. What Couchet found, case by case, was this. Many of the disappearances Berlitz cited had occurred during storms that Berlitz had not mentioned. Several had happened well outside the triangular boundary Berlitz had drawn, sometimes by hundreds of miles. Some had occurred in the Pacific rather than the Atlantic. A number of the vessels cited as having vanished without explanation had in fact been found, their fates documented in records Berlitz had not consulted. In some cases, the ships Berlitz described had not existed. The accumulation of cases that had seemed, in Berlitz's presentation, to constitute an overwhelming pattern of regional anomaly turned out, when checked against the primary record, to be substantially a product of selective presentation, factual error, and the omission of explanatory context. This did not mean that every case in the triangle literature was explained. Some were not. The Cyclops remained unexplained. The Carol Deering remained unexplained. A number of other documented disappearances had no fully satisfactory account in the record, but the pattern, the sense that this particular region of the Western Atlantic produced losses at a rate anomalous enough to require supernatural or extraordinary explanation, did not survive contact with the actual documentation. The ocean takes ships and aircraft in the Bermuda Triangle region at rates consistent with other heavily trafficked ocean areas when the volume of traffic is accounted for. This is the finding. It is a quiet finding, less dramatic than 20 million copies of a book about dimensional portals, but it is what the record shows. Lloyd's of London arrived at essentially the same conclusion from a different direction. The insurance market at Lloyd's had been underwriting ships transiting the Western Atlantic for centuries, and their actuarial records, the accumulated data of which vessels were lost, where, under what conditions, and at what rate, represented a different kind of evidence from naval investigation files or newspaper accounts. It was the evidence of money, which has a clarifying effect on questions of risk. If the Bermuda Triangle were genuinely anomalous, if ships and aircraft disappeared there at rates substantially above what the traffic density would predict, Lloyd's would have priced that anomaly into their premiums. Risk that is real costs more to insure. Lloyd's has repeatedly stated, formally and on the record, that the Bermuda Triangle does not represent a statistically anomalous zone of maritime loss. Ships transiting the region are not charged elevated premiums to reflect a higher risk of disappearance. The actuarial data, built from centuries of underwriting claims in the Western Atlantic, does not support the claim that this particular stretch of ocean is more dangerous than comparably trafficked ocean regions elsewhere. That statement exists in an archive somewhere, a letter on Lloyd's stationery, the plain institutional language of an insurance market addressing a public misconception, filed and retrievable, quietly contradicting the 20 million copies of the Berlitz book sitting on shelves around the world. The gap between those two things, the Lloyd's letter and the Berlitz book, is the distance between the documented record and the legend it became. It is not a small distance. It is the distance between a region of the Western Atlantic that has normal maritime loss rates and a zone of anomalous disappearance so powerful that it consumed the crews of planes and ships and kept what it took. The US tuuer finu, bikasti aspukuer. Zoa prudsnotoets, the PFT handrif third, bika fails grisi, or you down quambirds of planes, and if sit didn't pay so did tramps. Coast Guard has published similar statements in formal fact sheets available to the public, noting that when loss rates in the Bermuda Triangle region are adjusted for traffic volume, they are consistent with other heavily used ocean areas. The Coast Guard's position, like Lloyd's, is institutional and data-based, the product of agencies that have processed maritime distress calls and incident reports in the region for decades, and whose records do not reveal a pattern that requires extraordinary explanation. None of this made Berlitz's book disappear from the shelves. None of it prevented the Bermuda Triangle from retaining its place in popular consciousness as a zone where ordinary explanation failed. The legend had accumulated too much momentum, too many readers, too many films and television programs, and classroom discussions for a librarian's careful archival work, or an insurance market's formal statement to substantially alter its cultural weight. The triangle endured as a cultural fact, even as the evidence for its anomalous character quietly drained away. There is something worth sitting with in that gap. The USS Cyclops was a real ship. The Carol Deering was a real schooner, with real men aboard. Flight 19 was a real navigation exercise, with real pilots and real radio transmissions, and a real cold front moving through the area. The losses were genuine. The grief they produced in the families of the men who disappeared was genuine. The investigations that followed were genuine efforts to account for what had happened, conducted by agencies with access to the evidence and the professional expertise to assess it. These were real things. The triangle was a name drawn on a map, and then a magazine article, and then a book, and then 20 million books, and then a cultural fixture. The real losses and the legendary framework existed on different planes. The losses in the documentary record, plain and documented, and often partially explicable. The legend in the popular imagination, vast and dramatic, and shaped by selection and omission, and the human preference for a pattern that means something over a sequence of maritime accidents that mean nothing except that the ocean is large and conditions change. Gaddis did not invent the losses. He named the pattern he believed they formed. Berlitz extended that pattern across a much wider canvas, populating it with cases drawn from a record he consulted selectively, and framing them with theories that reached far beyond what the evidence supported. Kusha went back to the primary documentation and found that the pattern was largely an artifact of how the material had been handled. Lloyd's looked at their actuarial data and found normal maritime risk. The Coast Guard looked at their incident reports and found consistent loss rates. The official record, in other words, reached a conclusion that the popular culture declined to adopt. The Bermuda Triangle in 1974, when Berlitz's book appeared, was a zone of profound mystery. The Bermuda Triangle in the documentary record of Lloyd's and the Coast Guard was a section of the Western Atlantic with perfectly ordinary insurance rates. Both of these things were true at the same time, in the same year, on the same patch of ocean. The mystery was real to the people who believed it. The normality was real to the actuaries who priced it. What Gaddis's article began, the naming, the drawing of a boundary, the identification of a zone, was an act of narrative cartography. The territory it mapped was genuine ocean with genuine weather and genuine maritime hazard and genuine disappearances that had not been fully explained. The map was not inaccurate about the ocean's existence or even about the fact of the losses. It was inaccurate about what the losses meant, about whether they formed a pattern that required the boundary to explain them, about whether the zone was doing something to ships and aircraft that the ocean elsewhere was not doing. By the time Kusha published his findings in 1975, and Lloyd's had made its position formally known, the map was already so widely distributed that the territory it described had effectively become the territory in the minds of most people who thought about this part of the ocean at all. The Bermuda Triangle existed as a fact of popular geography in a way that no subsequent correction was entirely able to undo. 20 million copies of a book about Atlantean crystals and dimensional portals had done something to the cultural record that a librarian's careful archival review could document but could not reverse. The triangle persists. The Carol Deering remains unexplained. The Cyclops remains in the record as 309 men and a large cargo vessel that vanished without a trace. In March 1918, Flight 19 carries the Navy's amended finding of cause unknown. These open cases are real. Their openness is real. The ocean did take these vessels and these men and did not return them in any form that answered the question of what had happened. What the Triangle legend added to these real mysteries was a framework that made the openness feel like evidence, as though the absence of an explanation were itself a clue pointing towards something beyond the ordinary, as though the ocean's failure to yield a satisfying answer were proof that the answer could not be found in ordinary physics or ordinary weather or ordinary navigational error. The framework was seductive because unanswered questions are uncomfortable, and a named zone of anomaly is more comfortable than the plain acknowledgement that the ocean sometimes keeps what it takes without explanation. Kusha's stack of annotated Coast Guard reports on a library desk at Arizona State University in 1974 and 1975 is a different kind of image than Berlitz's book in a bookstore window. The stack of reports is smaller, less visually dramatic, harder to hold, full of technical language about incident circumstances and weather conditions and vessel specifications. It is not the kind of thing that sells 20 million copies. It is the kind of thing that an institution keeps in its files and a librarian finds when she goes looking, and that quietly, carefully adjusts the record without making a great deal of noise in doing so. The Lloyd's letter in its archive is quieter still, a document in a building in London written in the institutional language of an insurance market, making a precise and formal statement about actuarial data and maritime risk premiums. It was not written for popular consumption. It was written to address a specific factual claim about insurance rates. It sits in the archive because archives hold documents, and because the formal position of one of the world's oldest insurance markets on the question of the Bermuda Triangle's anomalous character is the kind of thing that should have a written record. These documents, held together, Cush's annotated research, Lloyd's formal statement, the Coast Guard's published fact sheets, form a body of counter-evidence that the popular legend largely moved around rather than through. The legend was too large, too distributed, too deeply embedded in global popular consciousness to be dislodged by careful archival work and actuarial data. The 20 million copies of Berlitz's book had already been read. The readers had already carried the triangle into their understanding of the Western Atlantic. Gaddis's pencil shape between Miami and Bermuda and Puerto Rico had become a feature of the imaginative map of the world in a way that corrections filed in archives had not. That gap between the Lloyd's letter and the Berlitz book, between Cush's annotated research and the 20 million copies, is itself a kind of record. It documents the distance a name can travel from the facts it was drawn from, the altitude a legend can reach above the documentary evidence that underlies it, the persistence with which a compelling story holds its shape in the culture, even when the evidence for it has been carefully examined and found to be considerably less than the story required. The Bermuda Triangle is a journalist's phrase coined in 1963 for an article published in February 1964. The triangular region it names is a real stretch of ocean. The losses it claims are largely real, though some are documented with far more care than others, and several belong more to the legend than to the record. The anomalous character of the region, the claim that it produces disappearances at rates or under circumstances that cannot be accounted for by ordinary maritime and aeronautical hazard, is not supported by the actuarial data, the Coast Guard incident statistics, or the careful archival review Cush completed in 1975. The open cases are open because the ocean is large and evidence disperses, and some accidents leave nothing behind that can be read. The USS Cyclops sailed from Barbados in March 1918 and was not seen again, and that is a real and unresolved fact in the naval record, independent of any triangular framework. The Carol Deering was found aground off Cape Hatteras in January 1921 with the crew gone and the galley stove still warm, and that too is a real and unresolved fact in the records of 3 separate government investigations independent of any triangular framework. These cases sit in the documentary record exactly as they have sat there for decades. The Cyclops file, the Carol Deering investigation, the Board of Inquiry findings, real documents in real archives, their questions genuine and still open. The triangle that was drawn around them in 1964 and extended and populated in 1974 and corrected in 1975 and formally addressed by Lloyd's actuaries, is a separate thing from the cases themselves. The cases belong to the record. The triangle belongs to the story that was built from them. Somewhere in an archive there is a Lloyd's of London letter stating formally that the Bermuda Triangle carries no anomalous maritime loss rate and does not warrant elevated insurance premiums. On shelves around the world, there are 20 million copies of Charles Berlitz's book describing dimensional portals and Atlantean crystal fields and the inexplicable vanishing of ships and aircraft in a zone of profound regional mystery. Both of these things are real documents. They describe the same stretch of ocean. The distance between them, held quietly and without needing to resolve, is the distance between the legend and the record filed and factual and dry as actuaries' language is still there. The Gulf Stream moves north through the Straits of Florida at 4 miles per hour on nights when the surface is dark and the sky above it carries no stars. It has been doing this for longer than any record exists to document it. On the night of December 5th, 1945, it was carrying approximately 30 million cubic meters of water per second northward and northeast into the open Atlantic. Warm water moving through cold, the current steady and deep and indifferent what the surface above it held or had held or was no longer holding. Naval oceanographers, who later reviewed the disappearance of Flight 19, noted this fact with some care. They were not speculating. They were working through what the ocean does with things that enter it, and the Gulf Stream is one of the most complete and steady answers that question has. The Straits of Florida are narrow enough that the current fills them almost entirely, bank to bank. What enters the Gulf Stream at latitude 25 north does not stay there. It moves. Within 24 hours, it has traveled approximately 96 miles. Within a week, it is dispersed across an area that no search operation of the scale mounted in December 1945, or any scale plausible in 1945, could have meaningfully covered. The oceanographers noted that wreckage from a ditching in or near the Gulf Stream's path would be carried north and northeast at sufficient speed that the search grids established in the days immediately following the disappearance would already be searching behind the debris field by the time those grids were flown. This is not a proposed explanation for what happened to the 5 aircraft of Flight 19. It is a documented feature of the ocean in which they were flying. The current does not wait for searches to be organized. It simply moves, as it moved that night, carrying its 30 million cubic meters north, steady and warm and indifferent in the dark. The weather on December 5th, 1945, has been reviewed by meteorologists working from historical records. A cold front moved through the Bermuda Triangle region during the afternoon hours of that day, through the very area over which Flight 19 was navigating, during the very hours when its radio transmissions were growing shorter and more fragmented. The front produced rough seas. It reduced visibility. It drove gusty winds across a surface that was already difficult to read from the air on a clear day and became, under those conditions, nearly featureless. Meteorologists reviewing the historical case have described these conditions as fully sufficient. Those are the words the record holds. Fully sufficient to account for the loss of 5 aircraft carrying crews, unfamiliar with the specific navigational demands of overwater flight in the deteriorating afternoon. No regional anomaly is required. No special property of the Bermuda Triangle needs to be invoked. A cold front in December, moving east across warm water, producing the conditions that cold fronts produce in December. This is what the weather record shows. The weather chart for December 5th, 1945, showing the cold front's position at approximately 7 in the evening has isobars that sit close together over the triangle region. Tightly packed isobars indicate a steep pressure gradient, and a steep pressure gradient in that context means strong winds, turbulence at low altitude, and wave heights sufficient to make ditching, even a controlled, skilled ditching, a serious proposition. The forecaster's notation of rough seas and reduced visibility is written in the plain hand of a person recording conditions, not predicting a disaster. The chart was filled out and filed. The front moved through. The conditions it documented were already present when the radio log at Naz Banana River received its last broken transmission and noted, in the careful language of official record keeping, that no further contact was established. The U.S. Navy Hydrographic Office and NOAA have both documented the magnetic compass variation in the Bermuda Triangle region. It ranges from approximately 0 to 10 degrees west, depending on precise location within the triangle. A 10-degree variation is within normal navigational parameters. It is the kind of variation that navigation training exists to account for, and that standard flight procedures include corrections for. The Navy Board of Inquiry, reviewing the documented radio transmissions in which Taylor reported both his compasses malfunctioning simultaneously, noted that simultaneous failure of two independent compass systems in two aircraft would have been highly unusual. The board found no confirmed evidence of such a failure in the physical or investigative record. What the investigation found instead was a sequence of navigational decisions made under conditions of genuine uncertainty by a flight leader who had limited familiarity with the specific routes of Naz Fort Lauderdale and who was, by the evidence of his transmissions, uncertain of the flight's position from mid-afternoon onward. The compasses are in the record because Taylor reported them. What they actually did, whether they failed, whether they were misread, whether the report of their malfunction was itself a product of the spatial disorientation the position error had already produced, the investigation could not determine. The compass question sits in the case file, the same way most of the case file's key questions sit, noted, examined, and not resolved. Lawrence David Couchet was a librarian and a pilot. He worked at Arizona State University, and in 1975, he published a book called The Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved. The title carried more confidence than the content required, but the content was substantial. Couchet had gone to the primary sources. He had reviewed naval records, the same records, in many cases, that the popular accounts had cited without reproducing accurately. He had reviewed Coast Guard incident reports, Lloyd's insurance records, and newspaper archives from the dates and locations of the incidents cited in the Triangle literature. What he found was not a single dramatic revelation, but an accumulation of smaller, quieter corrections. Some incidents described as occurring within the Triangle had occurred in entirely different geographic regions. Some disappeared ships had disappeared in storms severe enough to appear in weather records, but absent from the popular accounts that cited their vanishing as mysterious. Some incidents had been dated incorrectly. Some had involved vessels or aircraft whose wreckage had in fact been found, though the discovery was not noted in the accounts that listed them as without explanation. The pattern across these findings was not that the Triangle was a normal region with nothing to explain. Some of the cases Couchet examined remained genuinely open. The pattern was that the legend had been built in significant part from errors of fact that primary documents did not support, and that Etuamartabia her region was a law staggered, her Chris of Summel, that while live sportly, was live sports chip Bible to really, well live sports and if humanity. Couchet's copy of the Berlitz book, worked through at a library desk at Arizona State University, with a stack of primary documents beside it, produced a body of annotations. The margins of the book held his corrections. The stack beside it held the documents that made the corrections possible: Coast Guard incident forms, Lloyd's records, Navy investigation summaries, newspaper reports from the actual dates and locations of the cited disappearances. This is the kind of work that does not produce dramatic conclusions. It produces a correction, and the correction is quieter than the legend it corrects. Berlitz's book sold more than 20 million copies. Kusha's response was read by a considerably smaller audience and made considerably less noise. This does not change what the documents contained. It does not change what the primary sources showed. It simply notes the relationship between a legend at full circulation and the careful work of revision, that the revision is slower, quieter, and reaches fewer people than the version that preceded it, and that this is simply how the record corrects itself when it corrects itself at all. The Navy Board of Inquiry that convened after the December 5th disappearance initially attributed the loss to Taylor. The finding was pilot error. Taylor's family disputed this. The finding was amended. The amended classification is the one that remains on record: cause unknown. These words carry a specific meaning in the context of a Navy investigation. They do not mean that the investigators believed something impossible had occurred. They mean that the investigation could not establish a cause with the degree of certainty that a formal finding requires. This is a meaningful distinction. Cause unknown is not a declaration of mystery in the popular sense. It is an institutional acknowledgement of the limits of what the available evidence permitted the investigation to conclude. The amended finding acknowledges that Taylor could not, on the available record, be held individually responsible for a loss whose contributing causes, the weather, the navigation error, the deteriorating radio contact, the advancing afternoon, the cold front, formed a chain too complex and too incompletely documented to be reduced to a single point of origin. The case file in which this amended finding sits contains the complete documentary record of the investigation. It contains the radio log entries from NAS Fort Lauderdale and NAS Banana River, including the times and partial transcripts of each transmission received from Taylor and the flight. It contains the weather records for December 5th, the investigation of the PBM Mariner Training 49, and the explosion observed by the USS Solomons at approximately 7:50 in the evening. It contains the witness statements, the search vessel logs, the summary accounts from the more than 300 aircraft and 21 Navy vessels and 4 Coast Guard vessels that covered approximately 250,000 square miles of ocean in the 5 days following the disappearance. Every piece of paper that was gathered in the investigation, every statement that was recorded and signed and filed, is in that folder. The folder is still in the archive. The case file is still on record. The investigation neither concluded nor resolved. It simply reached the point where the available evidence had been exhausted, and what remained was the amended classification typed on the final page and the folder closed around it. The National Memorial Cemetery of the Pacific sits in the Punch Bowl crater in Honolulu, Hawaii. The crater is an extinct volcanic tuff cone, and the bowl of it holds the cemetery in a wide open space that the Hawaiian light crosses slowly through the afternoon. On the walls of the missing, engraved in stone in the curved surface of that memorial structure, are the names of service members whose remains were never recovered, men and women who died in the service of the United States military and were not found. Among those names are the 14 airmen of Flight 19. Taylor is there, Powers is there, Gerber is there, Peonessa and Thalander are there, and the other 9 men who flew that afternoon, and the 13 crew members of Training 49 who lifted off from NAS Banana River at 7:27 in the evening and did not return are there as well. 27 names, engraved in the stone of a wall in Honolulu, set among thousands of other names, the Hawaiian afternoon light moving across the curved surface as it moves across all the surfaces in that open volcanic bowl, steady and warm, and without preference for one name over another. The wall of the missing does not distinguish between the explained and the unexplained. It does not note, beside any name, the official classification of the investigation that followed the loss. It holds names. It holds the fact of service and the fact of absence, and it holds these things in stone, which is not indifferent, but is permanent in a way that paper is not. The case file is paper. The amended finding typed on its last page is paper. The radio log entries at Fort Lauderdale and Banana River are paper, held in folders and archives, subject to the ordinary deterioration of documents over decades. The names on the wall of the missing are in stone, and the Hawaiian light continues to move across them in the afternoons, as it has moved across them since the wall was built, and will continue to move across them in the afternoons that follow. The Gulf Stream on the night of December 5th, 1945, was carrying what it carries: water, warmth, the steady northward current that does not vary in its direction or its speed regardless of what passes through the region above it. What enters the ocean at that latitude and in that longitude, carried by the current, moves north and northeast across thousands of miles of open water, dispersing as it goes, thinning into the wider ocean until the specific density of what was there becomes indistinguishable from the general density of the sea around it. This is not a conclusion about Flight 19, it is a fact about the Gulf Stream. The oceanographers noted it in their review because it was relevant to the documented absence of recoverable wreckage. The absence of wreckage is consistent with what the current does. Consistency is not the same as certainty, and the oceanographers did not claim certainty. They noted the consistency and filed it in the record where it remains. The cold front that moved through the region on the afternoon of December 5th had passed entirely through by the following morning, when the search aircraft launched at dawn found clear skies and a sea state that was rough but improving. By that time, the Gulf Stream had been carrying whatever it carried for approximately 12 hours. The search grids were flown. The ocean surface was scanned by binoculars from search vessels whose crews lined the rails and looked out at gray winter water. The Gulf Stream ran beneath them at 4 miles per hour, carrying its 30 million cubic meters north, and the surface above it returned nothing that the search could identify as belonging to the 5 Avengers or to Training 49. The search continued for 5 days. The ocean surface over the course of those 5 days returned nothing. The search was stood down. The vessels made their last passes and turned back toward port. The ocean continued as it had continued before the search began and would continue after it ended. Kutcha's investigation produced something that the popular literature on the Bermuda Triangle had not produced, which was a systematic comparison between documented claims and primary sources. The methodology was not elaborate. It was methodical. It required access to the archives and a willingness to work through them document by document, checking the dates, the locations, the weather records, the official findings against the versions that had circulated in print. The versions in print were frequently wrong in ways that the primary documents corrected quietly and without drama. Couchet was a librarian, which is to say he was trained to find primary sources and to compare what they contained to secondary claims made on their behalf. This is not a remarkable skill in an academic context. Applied to the Bermuda Triangle literature, it produced findings that the primary sources had always contained. Waiting for someone to work through them with sufficient patience. The library desk at Arizona State University, where this work was done, is not a dramatic location. It is a desk in a library with documents on it and a book with annotated margins. The work done there was careful and specific and produced a record that sits beside the popular record of the Bermuda Triangle, as the correction sits beside the thing it corrects, smaller, quieter, less widely read, and more closely aligned with what the primary documents actually show. This is not unusual. It is the ordinary condition of archival revision in the face of popular mythology, and it proceeds at the pace that careful revision always proceeds, which is considerably slower than the pace at which legends distribute themselves. There is a question of what the Bermuda Triangle actually is, geographically, which is worth holding for a moment in the plain light of what the record shows. The region bounded by Miami, Bermuda, and Puerto Rico, the triangular outline that Vincent Gaddis drew on the page of his February 1964 article in Argosy magazine, and that became one of the most recognized geographic shapes in popular culture, is a heavily trafficked area of ocean. The shipping lanes between the eastern United States and the Caribbean, and between the Caribbean and Europe, run through or near it. The air routes across the same area carry substantial traffic. High traffic volume produces, by simple probability, a higher absolute number of incidents than low traffic volume would produce in an identical area of ocean. Lloyd's of London, reviewing loss rates in the region against traffic volume, found no anomalous concentration of incidents. The losses that occur there are consistent with loss rates in other heavily trafficked ocean areas when adjusted for the volume of vessels and aircraft moving through them. This finding, that the region is not statistically anomalous when the denominator of traffic volume is included, is the finding that the insurance record supports. It is not a finding that resolves the specific cases that make up the triangle legend, many of which remain genuinely open. It is a finding about the statistical pattern, and the pattern does not support the legend's central claim. Lloyd's of London's formal statement on the Bermuda Triangle is the kind of document that exists in an archive, filed among actuarial assessments and institutional correspondence, written in the plain language of risk assessment rather than the heightened language of mystery. Coverage transiting the region are not charged higher premiums. The region does not appear in Lloyd's records as a zone of elevated risk. This document sits in an archive somewhere, a letter, a formal statement, perhaps a published fact sheet, and it contains language that quietly contradicts the 20 million copies of the Berlitz book that were placed in bookstore windows in 1974, with their blue ocean covers facing outward. The document is not dramatic. The Berlitz book was. The document is still correct. The legend is still circulating. The night of December 5th, 1945, proceeded past the point where the radio log at Naes Banana River made its last entry about Flight 19, and the hours that followed were ordinary hours in all the ways that hours are ordinary, when the emergency they were framed around has moved past the point where anything can be done. The search would begin in the morning. The night was dark. The Gulf Stream moved. The cold front continued east. The ocean surface, rough under the advancing front, carried whatever it carried north into the wider Atlantic without returning any of it to the shore. This is the documented record of that night. It is not an explanation. It is the record of what followed the last transmission and what the record is able to say about the hours that the record could not reach. Somewhere in the course of the 5 days of the search, a search vessel's crew leaned on the rail and looked out at the surface of the Atlantic. The binoculars were raised. The water was gray and indifferent, and the Gulf Stream moved beneath the hull at 4 miles per hour in the direction that it always moves, which is north and northeast, carrying its enormous volume of warm water outward into the open ocean. The crew watched the surface. The surface returned nothing they could see. They moved to the next grid. They looked again. The ocean continued. At the end of the 5 days, the search was stood down, and the vessels made their last passes and turned toward port, and the ocean surface remained as it had remained throughout, broad gray, carrying whatever it carried north, too wide and too deep and too continuous for the record to follow. The amended case file classification, cause unknown, does not resolve the case. It acknowledges the investigation's conclusion about what the investigation was unable to establish. This is a meaningful kind of document. It is not a declaration of mystery. It is an honest record of what the investigation found and did not find, filed by people who had spent months working through what the available evidence could support, and who had arrived at the only classification the evidence permitted. The file is real. It is in an archive. It contains everything that was gathered. The words cause unknown are on its final page, and that page is still there. In an archive in the United States, the Navy records where this case has always resided. The manila folder holding the radio logs and the weather reports and the witness statements and the board findings and the amendment, the complete documentary record of what happened on December 5th, 1945, from the moment the 5 Avengers taxied on the apron at NAS Fort Lauderdale, to the moment the last broken transmission passed through the receiver at NAS Banana River, and the log noted silence. That folder is still there. It has not been resolved. It has not been reopened in any formal sense. It simply continues to exist as documents continue to exist in the dark and the quiet of the archive, undisturbed by the searches and the books and the magazine articles and the insurance actuarial assessments that have gathered around the questions it contains. The Gulf Stream tonight is moving north through the Straits of Florida at 4 miles per hour. It is carrying approximately 30 million cubic meters of water per second northeast into the open Atlantic, as it was carrying them on the night of December 5th, 1945, and as it was carrying them before that night, and will carry them after. The water is warm, the current is steady, the surface above it in winter is dark and wide, and does not hold the light that is not there to hold. What the current carries, it carries north. What enters the ocean in that region disperses across the wide, cold Atlantic over the days and weeks that follow, thinning gradually into the broader water until it is simply part of the ocean and indistinguishable from it. This is the Gulf Stream. This is what it does. The case file is in the archive. The wall of the missing is in the Punchbowl crater in Honolulu. The amended finding is on the last page of the folder. The Gulf Stream is moving north through the Straits of Florida. All of this is happening at once in the ordinary coexistence of documents and stone and ocean currents that continues whether any particular case is being examined or not. The investigation does not require attention to continue. The memorial does not require visitors. The ocean does not require observation. These things persist in their particular ways. The folder in the archive, the names in the stone, the current moving north through dark water, and they will persist in the same ways when this narration has ended and the room is quiet again. The same way they persisted through the 5 days of the search and the decades that followed the search and all the years between December 1945 and now. There is something in the nature of a case classified cause unknown that is worth holding for a moment without pressing toward a conclusion. The classification is not an invitation to fill the space it leaves with explanation. It is an honest record of the outer edge of what investigation found. The investigation went as far as the evidence permitted. The evidence did not permit it to go all the way.